In this video, we're going to talk about understanding and listening to the community. It's one of the fundamental roles in community development. And what we're going to be looking at are a number of concepts in relation to this, starting with social capital and then followed by asset mapping. We'll talk about the process and practice of community engagement and facilitating community conversations, and then talk about capacity building as a concept and also as an ongoing practice. There will be resources shared and some homework for you as well. Social capital has been described in a number of ways. The definition that I'm going to take for this training is one developed by Ager and Strang, who talked about social capital in relation to settlement of refugee communities. And they talked about social capital having three broad areas, one of them being bonding capital, which is the domain of local neighbourhood connections, bridging capital, which is networks extending beyond the local environment, translating into broader opportunities and resources. This was seen as being fairly integral to long-term success for people settling and integrating into a new community. And linking capital, which is links to services. It's the basis for referrals. This is a model of Ager and Strang's concept or their framework. They talk about rights and citizenship being the foundation for successful integration. Facilitators of social capital are language and cultural knowledge, having the relevant knowledge to fit in and communicate effectively, and safety and stability. So this is around safe housing, feeling safe in the neighbourhood and so forth. And then social bonds, social bridges, and social links being the three forms of capital that facilitate broad social connection. Our outcomes then are in the areas of employment, housing, education, and health. So they talk about this in the context of settlement, of new migrant communities, but it is most definitely applicable in a broad sense to the mainstream community. Asset mapping, it stems from asset-based community development, which McKnight and Kretzmann developed. There are a number of significant contributors to this field. Peter Kenyon in Australia is one of the leading international figures in asset-based community development. So we have a lot of asset mapping resources available to us in the Australian context. Asset mapping is obviously based on community assets and community strengths. So it's taking a strength-based perspective, identifying and activating the internal values, perspectives, knowledge and skills, the experiences of people in identifying what they have and what they can use to develop themselves and their communities. Asset mapping and asset-based community development are ideally driven by communities bottom up, and they're very relationship-based. So they involve participating people in a conversation, empowering people to have a voice and to speak up about what values are important to them, what skills and knowledge they have that they want to use for their own furtherment. And appreciative inquiry here is a very useful tool for facilitating this practice. What appreciative inquiry means basically is a specific way of asking questions which gets people to think about what really is valuable to them, what is meaningful to them, and what do they want for their own future. And it can then lead people to think about, okay, to reach that future, what do I have to help me get there? A lot of the time people don't understand the assets they carry with them in the forms of values, skills, knowledge, experience. And it's really important to create an environment where people can explore that and discover what they possess. Community engagement is a very broad practice nowadays. It has developed within community development, but is now used in a number of other sectors as well. People have noticed the power of this practice. The International Association of Public Participation, or IAP2, They talk about a spectrum of public participation, a spectrum of engagement. It's quite useful to look at the IAP2 resources to get a sense of what's involved in these different levels of community engagement. They talk about, at a very basic level, informing communities is a form of engagement. It's not a very active form of engagement, but it's the starting point. Then consulting with communities, so asking people specific questions to get answers that will hopefully guide decision making in practice. Involving communities in initiatives and decisions, collaborating directly with communities, and then finally empowering people to actually make their own decisions and enact them in public. So in the community development space, obviously we'll be informing people along the way of things that are going on, but ideally it's great to find ways to not only consult with people, but to involve them actively in processes as far as possible. In undertaking community engagement, it's really important to start with what is the question that we want to answer? What do we want to find out? And who are we going to ask? Who's going to be involved in this? Who are going to be the stakeholders? It's really important to get this right at the outset, asking the right question in terms of what's relevant to the community, and making sure that we include all of the relevant stakeholders. If we miss people out, there's going to be problems for the rest of the process. Selection of methods for community engagement. So there are a very large number of methods. There are some very fancy ones, but to be honest, you can do quite well with the most basic, the most fundamental methods. Simple interview, conversation. Implement the engagement and record findings is a critical step. Obviously, we need to actually undertake the work and record it reliably and professionally. We need to evaluate the engagement activity and respond to our findings. A lot of the time, engagements are undertaken and then nothing ever seems to happen with it. We want to make sure that if we're going to make this effort to connect with people and talk to them, that we're going to do something with the results of that. Feedback to stakeholders. So it's unfortunately quite common for engagements to occur, and then for the people involved in those engagements to never really find out what happened with that process. Did my voice get heard? Did something happen because of what I said? So having the feedback loop to the people involved in the engagement is really important. It keeps people connected for future work with them. Facilitating community conversations is a concept that the Tamarack Institute has particularly developed. There's a book called Community Conversations, which I really encourage you to look online at and to get a copy of if you're really interested in this. The basic premise is that the things we're trying to deal with in community engagement are often quite complex. Community issues are complex, but the way we can address that is through the most simple, fundamental tools of human communication. We create environments for conversation, and through that conversation, there's creative moments, there's ideas that are generated which people relate to, that people own, and it starts a process whereby we can address complexity in a way which is harmonious within the local context. Community conversations, when they're performed well, they build trust among people, they build connection, and develop a shared awareness and perspective of the issues and of the challenges, resulting in respect, reciprocity, and shared vision and hope. This is a form of social momentum for change. We need to be able to provide adequate briefing to people on the purpose of the conversation and the expectations, that and get a common sense of expectations of what we hope to achieve from the process. We need to take very good notes of the conversation and be able to provide them very quickly to the stakeholders afterwards, so that people continue to feel engaged, continue to feel like there is actually something happening here, there's progress, it keeps people motivated. We need to be able to follow up on actions and next steps. We need to be quick about this, and we need to be really open about what we've done. If there's been a delay, why has there been a delay? Keep that conversation going along the way too. So, okay, there was an action that came up, but there's been new developments. What are we going to do to address these moving forward? A community conversation can be a regular chat among 2 or more people. It can be a group meeting. It can be formal. It can be semi-formal. It can be informal. But really, it's about capturing the content, feeding it back, following up on action points. It's the most basic meeting and action follow-up processes that you can think of, really. A number of techniques are available if you want to get into some, I guess, some interesting or trendy ideas. Conversation cafes, peer-to-peer networks. There's some very far out experimental ones here as well if you want to have a look at them. The resources that the International Association for Public Participation have are quite extensive. They'll list dozens and dozens of techniques that you can use for community engagement. The Tamarack Institute as well, and again, look at Paul Bourne as the author of the book Community Conversations. Have a look for that book if you can. It's a great introduction to this whole topic. Capacity building is really the ultimate aim of all of this, of having community conversations, of undertaking community engagement. It's about achieving growth from within, individuals, groups, and communities as a whole being able to grow themselves through greater awareness of their strengths and greater practice of their strengths. It relies on an environment where people are autonomous, able to have a voice, able to make their own decisions, where people feel empowered and confident to participate. And people will need support with this as well, so being able to provide timely support. One really important message that I want to get across here is that capacity building isn't a project. It isn't something you implement in a 6-month period. It should really, to be genuine, it needs to be ongoing. It involves being involved in that community for the long term. There's a lot of initiatives that come up which claim to be capacity building, but they're a 6-month or a 12-month intervention, a service coming into a community, trying to get something happening and then leaving at the end, hoping along the way that they set a community up to do this for themselves into the future. That's not really genuine capacity building. To do this right, it involves being in the community for a long time, ideally being there for a long time and listening before trying to do anything for people, but rather listening to people and letting them have time to develop their approaches over time. Communities are very sensitive to genuine capacity building or non-genuine capacity building, so you can't really fake this. An ultimate aim is to develop leadership within the community itself. That can take a widely varying amount of time to achieve, depending on the dynamics of the community, the personalities involved, the challenges and conflicts within the community. Developing leadership and self-direction among individuals who can then work well together within the community is the ideal goal. People in some communities won't be able to work well together very easily. There may be limits to this in the long term, but we do what we can and we keep striving, we keep learning as we go. Building accountability within communities to look after their own interests, to look after themselves is also really important, particularly in communities where there's been a reliance on external supports or external controls. So that's quite an interesting area of work for some communities where they felt very disempowered. Building that sense of empowerment takes time, and with that, then we want to see some sense of ownership over the resources and accountability for looking after that within the community. Quite an interesting dynamic to see in practice when it's achieved. Capacity building can have creative and unpredictable results. You shouldn't go into this with a set idea of what's going to happen at the end. Communities and individuals will come up with their own ideas and new dynamics will form spontaneously out of the process. Capacity building and community engagement at their best, they really challenge the status quo. They resist dominant structures which have had an impact on equity and can be somewhat subversive at times as well. So it's a valuable process in terms of breaking down systems and structures that have held people down over a long period of time, but then it needs to be handled with care as a result because of the potential for controversy that can come out of the activity. Okay, so some resources here. I'm really just going to centre on the International Association for Public Participation and the TAMREC Institute. They're probably the two best resources I've come across for community engagement. It's well worth having a good look at their resources in this area, but by all means, look more broadly, look for Australian content as well on this to broaden your understanding and to get a sense of your how you would go about doing this. For your homework, after reviewing these resources, consider how you would go about undertaking community engagement in your context. And there's a few dot points here. What would be your purpose? What are the questions that you would have? So in the Community Hubs context, these might be guided to some extent by Community Hubs Australia in the development of the plan for your hub, but you may want to look more locally and more specifically within the communities you're working with as well. And by all means, you might want to talk to the community members themselves about what are their questions, what does the community want to answer in their own context. Think about who you need to consult, who the key stakeholders are. So obviously the immediate community members, but also the other parties that have a role in your centre or your hub. How do you frame your processes? How do you describe what you're doing? How do you let people know what the purpose of this activity is and how you're going to undertake it, and the timeframes for follow-up and so forth. You obviously need to select engagement methods, and you need to work out how you're going to ensure that you're going to respond quickly in terms of providing notes of meetings, reports on follow-up and so forth. What are the risks that you need to consider? So community engagement is a fairly inherently risky process. By virtue of starting this process, you're setting up expectations that something's going to happen. And so you need to be able to think before you start about what are the risks here? What if people ask for things which aren't achievable? Am I confident that I can communicate with people and help them to understand what is and isn't possible? And so on. It really pays to have a good look at risk before you start this process in order to maintain a good connection with your community. And then how do you sustain engagement and involvement beyond the initial process? So this is really about how do you maintain a long-term relationship with your community in and amongst your specific engagement activities. So there's quite a lot there. And I really encourage you to spend some time looking at the resources on community engagement and envisaging how you would undertake it, and ideally going through this whole process. Do it with peers, do it with supporters who've been there before and done it, and really build your knowledge through trying it out.